The following is a look at the killers of Dead by Daylight, and any real-world equivalents they might have. Let's continue. Anna, aka the Huntress. I was interested to realise this is our first killer not from or based in the USA. The entity has apparently got bored of Uncle Sam and instead went to Uncle Joe. Well, before the revolution. This is also the first killer where we have a good idea of what time the events took place. The early 20th century, before 1918. Living deep in the forest in voluntary isolation, presumably, Anna was a young isolationist with her mother. There was reference to Anna's father in the tome, and this father was possibly killed by a soldier. The bereavement continues. When Anna and her mother were hunting an elk in the forest, that elk killed her mother. As she died, she sung Anna's favourite lullaby. Still a child, Anna had to make do on her own. I'm not going to tag her as an infant zoo sadist because the hunting was for sustenance and survival, not sadism, but if anyone thinks the Huntress is a more sympathetic killer, they're in for a rude awakening. As the years rolled by, Anna hunted larger and larger animals until she started hunting the humans that wandered into her territory. She had lost her humanity, and I think would be classified as a serial killer. However, being so separate from society makes me question that label, but more on that later. Regardless, she escalated her crimes. Anna raided villages, slaughtered entire families, and took what she wanted. It isn't clear how many people Anna killed, but apparently she didn't directly murder the little girls. Instead, they were effectively kidnapped and held prisoner until they died of cold or starvation or disease. Obviously, they lacked the intense survival skills Anna had growing up. Their deaths sent Anna deeper into the arms of madness. I don't want to think about the trauma those children went through. They watched their family be brutally murdered, and were then taken captive by the murderer herself. Then they die a slow and painful death because their captor doesn't understand that small children need to be taken care of. Anna did notice the girls were traumatized, and decided to wear that mask to make them feel more at ease, in possibly the most misguided fashion decision since Leatherface's brand of boxers. There are many tags I could apply to the case of the Huntress, but I don't know if I should. Perhaps you'd argue manslaughter, but I am going to tag the Huntress as a torturer and a child killer. Weirdly, she's also a thief, and technically takes trophies. The trope of trophies is becoming problematic for this project. Unlike real serial killers, DBD characters don't take trophies to remind themselves of their murders, with some exceptions. But again, the circumstances are very strange. Anna is outside any meaningful civilized law, so this feels like a case of blue and orange morality, and we can't judge her by our own standards. Much of Anna's story is pure fantasy, a killer that is just too out there. But are there any comparisons? Isolationism didn't come up at all except for Ted Kaczynski, aka the Unabomber, who abandoned society to live alone in the woods. But as a bomber, Kaczynski has nothing else in common with the Huntress. Israel Keyes was also something of an isolationist, at least at several points in his life, but he wasn't part of my project, and I already know any similarities end there. But the type of criminal to massacre a whole household was documented in my project. One of the closest comparisons is likely Anatoly Onoprienko, aka the Beast of the Ukraine, who'd murder entire families and steal whatever he wanted. I associate him more with fire though, as he allegedly burned down many properties while the Huntress was no arsonist. The two Chinese serial killers I featured in my project, Wang Qiang and Yang Xinhai, both also murdered entire families, and they sometimes did so with an axe, the Huntress's primary weapon. Although the details are a little different, this kind of bloodlust really does exist in the real world. Much has been discussed about the Huntress's intellectual as well as emotional state, that she is somehow impaired. I understand why people may have thought this before her tome release. Anna has an absolutely hilarious woman-child temper tantrum upon certain stunts. Besides this, being removed from social contact for so long, and apparently not understanding little girls die if not taken care of, would suggest she's a bit wrong. But in the tome itself we hear her in a monologue and she sounds normal enough, at least not having the stunted mind of a little girl. Huntress is likely illiterate and inarticulate, but not mentally disabled. In the tome, we see she's found the battlegrounds of the First World War, and she stalks the camps, trying to understand what's happening. She's confused by the torture the soldiers inflict on their prisoners, but she still finds it funny, showing she's ultimately a sadistic character. Anna then toys with the soldiers a little more before killing dozens of them and taking what she wants. And what she wanted was a toy to give to one of her captives. She gives a blood-soaked doll to her child prisoner. This perfectly demonstrates just how far gone Anna really is. And when the war was over, the Huntress had disappeared. When considering kidnapping as a detail in my project, the perpetrators have been some of the absolute worst I've had to discuss. Huntress simply does not compare to the likes of Ivan Milat, the Hillside Stranglers, Fred West, William Bonin, and the Boneyard Killers Leonard Lake and Charles Ning. These cases have a very obvious and grim component to them. But there is one particularly horrible serial killer case from Alaska in the 70s and 80s that reminds me of this story. Robert Hansen, aka Butcher Baker, would kidnap sex workers and release them into the Alaskan wilderness, and then hunt them with his rifle. This case is particularly notorious, and he killed between 17 and 37 women. Turning to fiction, Huntress is partially based off the Eastern European stories of Baba Yaga. I won't go too deep into it, but I will mention there was a serial killer with that same nickname, a Russian woman named Tamara Samsonova. However, she was a poisoner, not a hunter, and once again, there really isn't much to compare. A better case study is in the Huntress's survivor counterpart, David King. But I'm not clear on what the theme of Lullaby for the Dark was. Survival? Contrasting the law of the jungle to the law of Manchester? Perhaps the chapter was trying to say something about masculinity or violence in nature versus masculinity or violence in an urban environment. King shows several traits of antisocial personality disorder: impulsive, hostile, callous, etc. I'd say he's characterised by rage, defiance, and some elusive issues with his father, as well as his repressed sexuality. I found that story regarding the fake gasoline pretty darn disturbing. Although I still have no idea what this means. Mither, meather, I don't know. I think either is fine. Either. Either. Oh, for God's sake. It doesn't matter. What does matter is David's temperament. Aggressive, impulsive, and reckless. King just loves a brawl and is one of the most physically imposing and by deed the physically darkest and most criminal of the survivors. But King isn't overtly selfish, and it's made clear that he does care for people around him and has a heart of gold. Huntress has no one around her. She was completely alone, in the dark. Lending herself nicely to the hunter archetype, her power is to throw hatchets, and sometimes at long or very long range. The cooldown after throwing a hatchet is shorter than a basic attack, thus making this an effective strike. Being the first ranged killer was another first, and was balanced with 110 movement speed, a special unalterable terror radius that's much larger than normal, and a need to reload, which brings the lockers back into play since Dwight stopped using them. The ability is very simple and elegant, but as cool as all of this is, I never really fell in love with her. I know she's one of the most beloved and picked killers on the roster and I want to be careful, but I just suck at her, and she's one of my least played. I suppose I'm just sick of going against her, and that infernal humming. Thank God for the Baba Yaga cosmetic skin which changes the sounds. Even though she wasn't the killer for me, the Huntress was the turning point for me. I think she's an amazing character, and when I first saw her trailer, I knew I had to be a part of this community. But my PC was too old and weak to run Dead by Daylight, so I had to save for a new rig. It would take nearly a year for me to finally join the fray. Maybe I should have just stuck with Constructor. After the release of the Huntress, Behaviour wasted no time in snagging some great horror icons to feature in their game. Leatherface, Freddy Krueger, and Amanda Young all burst onto the scene with... well, it's still a blast to have them, despite some technical difficulties. I was ignorant of those problems anyway, and as a certified horror nut, I just had to join in. I really should have just stuck with Constructor.
For 5 minutes. Could you not be yourself? For 5 months!